The wagon wheels creaked violently as they slid over the rocky edge, time slowing to a cruel crawl as Thea Blackburn felt her entire world tilt into oblivion. She couldn't scream as the ground disappeared beneath her, the vast canyon yawning below like the mouth of hell itself. In that suspended moment between life and death, a hand shot out from nowhere, fingers wrapping around her wrist with bruising force, anchoring her to the world of the living. Texas, 1874. The unforgiving summer heat shimmered across the landscape as Thea dangled over the edge of Eagle Pass Canyon, 20 miles outside of Sweetwater. Her belongings tumbled past her into the abyss, trunks of carefully packed dresses, family heirlooms, and all the modest wealth she'd brought west to start her new life. None of it mattered now as she stared up into the face of her savior, a sun-bronzed cowboy with eyes as sharp as flint. "Hold on, madam," he commanded, his voice strained with the effort of keeping her from plummeting to her death. "I've got you." Thea's fingers dug into his forearm as he began to pull. "The horses," she gasped, thinking of the poor animals that had been hitched to her wagon. "Are they safe?" he grunted, muscles straining visibly beneath his weathered cotton shirt. "They broke free when the edge started to crumble. Now stop talking and help me get you up." With a Herculean effort, he hauled her up and over the cliff's edge, both of them collapsing on solid ground in an ungraceful heap. For several moments, they lay there catching their breath, the enormity of what had just happened washing over them. "Thank you," Thea finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to sit up, wincing at the burning sensation in her shoulder where he'd pulled her to safety. "Don't mention it." He was already on his feet, dusting himself off and surveying the damage. Half of her wagon had disappeared over the cliff, the other half hanging precariously over the edge. "You shouldn't have been taking this route alone, madam. It ain't safe." "I wasn't given much choice in the matter," she replied, pride stiffening her spine as she rose to her feet. The main road was washed out from the storm 3 days past. The cowboy turned to face her properly, and Thea had her first good look at him. Tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges of his hat, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. His face was all hard planes and angles, softened only slightly by full lips currently pressed into a grim line. "Name's Roy Kincaid," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Ranch foreman at the Triple Diamond just north of here. Thea Blackburn." She offered her hand, then realized how improper that must seem and withdrew it, smoothing down her dusty skirts instead. "I was on my way to Sweetwater to take up a teaching position." Roy's eyebrows rose slightly. "The school teacher position, town's been waiting on you for 3 weeks. Most folks figured you weren't coming." Heat rose to Thea's cheeks. "I was delayed in San Antonio. My father fell ill and I couldn't leave until." She trailed off, unwilling to share her personal tragedy with a stranger, no matter how gallant his actions had been. Understanding flickered in his eyes. "No need to explain, Miss Blackburn." He glanced up at the sky. "Sun's getting low. We need to salvage what we can and get moving. I can offer you a place at the ranch for the night, and tomorrow I'll see about getting you to town." Thea looked at the remnants of her wagon and felt a wave of despair. Everything she owned was either destroyed or dangling precariously over the edge. "I can't impose. You're not imposing, you're surviving," Roy cut in, his tone brooking no argument. "Unless you plan on walking 15 miles to Sweetwater before nightfall." The reality of her situation hit Thea like a physical blow. She was alone in a harsh, unfamiliar landscape with no transportation, limited supplies, and night approaching. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Very well, Mr. Kincaid, I accept your offer." Roy nodded once and moved toward the cliff edge. "Good. Now let's see what we can save before the rest of this wagon decides to join its friends at the bottom." For the next hour, they carefully extracted what belongings they could from the half of the wagon still clinging to solid ground. Thea was surprised by Roy's methodical care as he tied ropes around trunks and crates, easing them back from the precipice. Her clothing trunk was retrieved, along with a small box of books and teaching supplies, and a portrait of her parents that had been wedged behind the driver's seat. That's all we can manage safely, Roy said finally, securing the last of her salvaged possessions onto his horse. The rest is either gone or not worth risking our necks for. Thea nodded, fighting back tears as she looked at the meager pile of belongings. Everything she owned in the world now fit on the back of a single horse. I've got a second mount just over the ridge, Roy explained, gesturing toward a nearby hill. Was tracking some strays when I heard your wagon go over. You can ride her back to the ranch. The sun was dipping toward the horizon by the time they crested the hill, and Thea saw Roy's second horse, a dappled mare, grazing peacefully as if the world hadn't nearly ended for someone just minutes ago. Roy helped her mount, his hands respectfully firm at her waist, then gathered the reins of his own horse, now laden with her possessions. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch, he said, swinging into his saddle with practiced ease. You comfortable enough? Thea adjusted her position, grateful that her father had insisted she learn to ride astride rather than side saddle. I'll manage, thank you. As they rode, the landscape opened up before them, rolling plains dotted with mesquite trees and cacti, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. In other circumstances, Thea might have found it beautiful, even majestic. But all she could think about was how close she'd come to death and how much she'd lost in a single moment of misfortune. If you don't mind my asking, Roy said, breaking the silence, what brought a proper Eastern lady out to Sweetwater? Teaching positions in Texas ain't exactly sought after. Thea considered deflecting the question but found herself too exhausted for pretense. My father lost everything in bad investments. When he died, there was nothing left. The teaching position in Sweetwater was one of the few opportunities available to me. I'm sorry about your father. Thank you. She studied his profile, curious despite herself. And what about you, Mr. Kincaid? Have you always been a ranch foreman? A hint of a smile touched his lips. Been working cattle since I was 14. Started as a ranch hand, worked my way up. The Triple Diamond's been my home for 6 years now. You must enjoy it. It's honest work. He glanced at her. Hard but satisfying in its way, though I reckon teaching has its own challenges. Thea couldn't help but laugh, a short, surprised sound. I suppose we'll find out. This will be my first proper teaching position. Roy raised an eyebrow. First. I was a governess for 2 years in Boston, but this is different. An entire schoolhouse of children from various backgrounds. She took a deep breath. I'm terrified if you want the truth of it. Honesty's always best out here, Roy said with an approving nod. West Texas doesn't suffer fools or pretenders for long. They fell into a companionable silence after that, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to the chaotic thoughts in Thea's mind. Just when she thought her tired body couldn't take much more, the Triple Diamond Ranch appeared on the horizon, a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings nestled in a protected valley. As they approached, Thea could see figures moving about, finishing evening chores. A man in his 60s emerged from the main house, squinting at them in the fading light. That's Mr. Sheffield, the owner, Roy explained quietly. Good man, tough but fair. They dismounted at the hitching post and Roy quickly explained the situation to his employer. Mr. Sheffield's weathered face creased with concern as he turned to Thea. Miss Blackburn, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. We've got a spare room in the main house. You're very kind, Mr. Sheffield, but I wouldn't want to impose. One night is all I need, and then I should continue to Sweetwater. The older man exchanged a look with Roy. Well, you just let us know what you need. Martha, he called to a middle-aged woman who had appeared in the doorway, we've got a guest for dinner and the night. Miss Blackburn here had some trouble on the road. Of course, Martha replied, coming forward with a warm smile. Come inside, dear, you look dead on your feet. Thea found herself ushered into the house, which was surprisingly comfortable for a remote ranch. Martha, who she learned was the housekeeper and cook, showed her to a small but clean room and brought hot water for washing. Dinner's in half an hour, Martha told her. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up. Left alone, Thea sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she realized how close she'd come to death. If Roy Kincaid hadn't happened along at that precise moment, A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Blackburn," Roy's voice came through the wood. "I've brought up your trunk and the box of books. The rest is safe in the barn." Thea opened the door, composing her features into what she hoped was a dignified expression. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid, for everything." He set the trunk down just inside the door, the box of books balanced on top. "It's no trouble." His eyes met hers and something in his gaze shifted, softening slightly. "Are you all right, really?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid her. "I will be," she managed, blinking rapidly to keep tears at bay. "It's just been rather overwhelming." Roy nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Rest up, Martha's stew will help put things in perspective." He tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Mr. Kincaid," Thea called after him. When he paused, looking back, she said simply, "I owe you my life." A small smile touched his lips. "Consider it a welcome to Texas, Miss Blackburn." Dinner was a simple but hearty affair: beef stew, cornbread, and stewed apples. Besides Mr. Sheffield and Martha, there was the ranch's bookkeeper, a soft-spoken man named Peterson, and to Thea's surprise, Roy joined them at the table rather than eating with the other hands in the bunkhouse. "Roy's practically family," Mr. Sheffield explained when he noticed Thea's questioning look. "Been with me since he was barely more than a boy, smartest cowhand I ever hired." Roy looked faintly embarrassed by the praise but said nothing, focusing on his food instead. The conversation flowed easily, with Mr. Sheffield asking polite questions about Thea's background and her plans for the school in Sweetwater. For her part, Thea found herself relaxing for the first time since the accident, the simple normality of the dinner table a balm to her frayed nerves. "Town's real excited about having a proper teacher again," Martha told her. "Last one left 6 months ago to get married. Since then, they've been making do with whoever could spare the time. I hope I can live up to their expectations," Thea said honestly. "You'll do fine," Roy said unexpectedly. When everyone looked at him, he added, "Anyone who keeps their head the way you did today when your wagon went over that cliff has the mettle to handle a room full of Texas children." Thea felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment, ridiculously out of proportion to its simplicity. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid." After dinner, Thea excused herself, exhaustion making her eyes heavy. Back in her room, she changed into her nightgown and slipped between cool sheets, expecting sleep to claim her immediately. Instead, her mind replayed the accident over and over: the sickening lurch as the wagon tipped, the brief weightlessness of falling, and then Roy's hand closing around her wrist, pulling her back to safety. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of falling endlessly into a dark chasm, reaching for a hand that never quite managed to catch her. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of another scorching Texas day ahead. Thea dressed in one of her simpler dresses, grateful that her clothing trunk had been among the items salvaged. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a face paler than usual, dark circles under her blue eyes testifying to her restless night. Breakfast was already underway when she entered the dining room, with Mr. Sheffield reading a newspaper and Martha setting out plates of eggs and bacon. Roy was nowhere to be seen. "Good morning, Miss Blackburn," Mr. Sheffield greeted her. "I trust you slept well." "As well as could be expected, thank you," Thea replied, taking the seat Martha indicated. "I'm sorry to be late." "Nonsense," Martha said, placing a cup of coffee before her. "After what you went through yesterday, you deserve to sleep as long as you needed." Thea sipped the strong coffee gratefully. "Has Mr. Kincaid already eaten?" "Roy's been up since before dawn, checking on some new calves," Mr. Sheffield explained. "He said to tell you he'll be ready to take you to Sweetwater around 9 if that suits." "That's very kind of him, but surely he has duties here. I wouldn't want to impose further." Mr. Sheffield waved away her concern. "The Triple Diamond can spare him for a day. Besides, I need him to pick up some supplies in town anyway." After breakfast, Thea thanked Martha warmly for her hospitality and went to gather her few belongings. She was just closing her trunk when a knock came at the door. Roy stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands. "Morning, Miss Blackburn. I've got the wagon ready whenever you are." "Wagon." Thea couldn't keep the apprehension from her voice. Understanding flickered in Roy's eyes. "It's perfectly safe," he assured her, "and we'll be taking the main road, no cliffs in sight, I promise." Despite herself, Thea smiled. "I'm ready now, Mr. Kincaid." The wagon was indeed waiting, hitched to two sturdy horses that looked far more reliable than the rental team that had pulled her ill-fated vehicle. Her trunk and other salvaged possessions were already loaded in the back. Mr. Sheffield came out to see them off, pressing a small package into Thea's hands. "Some of Martha's biscuits for the journey," he explained, "and a letter of introduction to Sheriff Mills in Sweetwater. He's an old friend. He'll make sure you're settled properly." "Thank you for everything," Thea said, genuinely touched by the kindness these strangers had shown her. Roy helped her up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins. With a click of his tongue, the horses moved forward and they were on their way to Sweetwater. The journey passed more pleasantly than Thea had expected. The main road was well-traveled and relatively smooth, and Roy proved to be good company, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the region. Thea found herself laughing at his dry observations about local characters and relaxing in his steady presence. "So what made you decide to become a teacher?" Roy asked as they passed a stand of cottonwood trees. "I've always loved learning," Thea replied honestly. "My father was a professor before he went into business. Our house was full of books, and he encouraged my education even when it wasn't fashionable for girls." She smiled at the memory. When our circumstances changed, teaching seemed the natural choice. "You could have married," Roy observed, glancing at her sideways. "Proper Eastern lady like yourself must have had offers." Thea stiffened slightly. "There was someone once, but he disappeared rather quickly when my father's finances collapsed." She hadn't meant to reveal so much and was surprised by her own candor. "Anyway, I prefer to make my own way." Roy nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Independence suits you, Miss Blackburn. Please call me Thea," she said impulsively. "After saving my life, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." A small smile touched his lips. "Thea it is then, and I'm Roy." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the rhythmic clop of hooves and creak of wagon wheels the only sounds. By mid-morning they crested a hill, and Thea got her first look at Sweetwater, a modest collection of buildings centered around a main street, with houses and small farms scattered around the periphery. "It's smaller than I expected," she admitted, "but growing," Roy pointed out. "The railroad's coming through next year, and that'll change everything." As they drove down the main street, Thea took in her new home the general store, saloon, sheriff's office, a small church, and there, at the end of the street, a simple wooden schoolhouse with a bell tower. Townspeople stopped to watch their passage, curiosity evident on their faces. They pulled up in front of a two-story building with a sign reading Sweetwater Hotel and Boarding House. "The school board arranged for you to stay here until you decide on permanent accommodations," Roy explained, setting the brake. "Mrs. Tillman runs the place. She's particular but fair." Before they could disembark, a stout woman in her 50s emerged from the hotel, followed by several other townspeople. "You must be Miss Blackburn," the woman said, coming forward. "I'm Edith Tillman. We'd nearly given up on you arriving." "I apologize for the delay, Mrs. Tillman," Thea said, accepting Roy's hand to help her down from the wagon. "I encountered some difficulties on the journey." "She lost most of her belongings when her wagon went over Eagle Pass Canyon yesterday," Roy explained, his tone matter-of-fact but his eyes daring anyone to ask for details that might embarrass Thea. There were gasps from the small crowd that had gathered. Mrs. Tillman's face softened immediately. "You poor dear, and you're all right. Thanks entirely to Mr. Kincaid," Thea said, glancing at Roy with gratitude. "He happened to be nearby and saved me from going over with the wagon." A distinguished-looking gentleman in his 60s stepped forward. "Miss Blackburn, I'm Judge Wilson, head of the school board. We're mighty relieved you've arrived safely despite your ordeal, and mighty grateful to you, Kincaid, for your timely intervention." Roy tipped his hat. "Just happened to be in the right place, Judge." "Well, we won't overwhelm you with introductions now," Judge Wilson said to Thea. Mrs. Tillman will get you settled, and perhaps you join me and the other board members for dinner this evening. We can discuss the school year, set to begin next week." "I'd be delighted," Thea replied, summoning a smile despite her fatigue. As the crowd dispersed, Roy began unloading Thea's trunk and other possessions. Mrs. Tillman directed a young boy to show him to the room she'd prepared. "I've got some errands to run," Roy told Thea when the trunk was safely delivered, "but I'll be in town until tomorrow morning if you need anything." Thea felt a surprising pang at the thought of his departure. "Thank you again, Roy, for everything." He touched the brim of his hat, that small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My pleasure, Thea. I suspect Sweetwater just got a lot more interesting." With that, he climbed back onto the wagon and drove off toward the general store, leaving Thea to follow Mrs. Tillman into the boarding house. Acutely aware of the curious gazes of the townspeople still lingering on the boardwalk, her room at the boarding house was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a small desk under the window that looked out onto the main street. Mrs. Tillman helped her unpack, clucking sympathetically over the limited nature of Thea's possessions. "We'll have to see about getting you some more things, dear," the older woman said. "Can't have our school teacher wanting for necessities." "You're very kind, but I'm sure I'll manage," Thea replied, arranging her precious books on the desk. "Judge Wilson's a good man," Mrs. Tillman continued, smoothing the bedspread. "Lost his wife 5 years back, but he's dedicated to the town. It was his idea to recruit a teacher from back east instead of making do with locals." "I'm grateful for the opportunity," Thea said sincerely. "And that Roy Kincaid," Mrs. Tillman added with a knowing look. "Quite the coincidence him being there to save you, wasn't it?" Thea felt her cheeks warm. "I consider it nothing short of miraculous. Another few seconds and I would have." "Well, he's a good man too, despite what some might say." That caught Thea's attention. "What do some say?" Mrs. Tillman looked briefly uncomfortable. "Oh, just idle gossip. Roy keeps to himself mostly, doesn't join in much with town doings. Some folks find that suspicious." She waved a dismissive hand. "But he's always been fair in his dealings, and old man Sheffield wouldn't keep him on if he weren't trustworthy." Before Thea could inquire further, Mrs. Tillman announced it was time for lunch and departed, leaving Thea to finish unpacking and wonder about the cowboy who had saved her life. The afternoon passed in a whirlwind of introductions and orientation. Judge Wilson arrived to escort her to the schoolhouse, where she met 2 of the other school board members, Dr. Peterson, the town physician, and Mrs. Abernathy, a formidable widow whose late husband had been the town's first mayor. The schoolhouse itself was modest but surprisingly well equipped, with rows of desks, a large chalkboard, and shelves of books that, while not new, appeared to be in good condition. "We've got about 30 children enrolled, ages 6 to 16, Judge Wilson explained as they toured the building. "Some can only come seasonally when farm work allows, but most attend regular-like." "And what curriculum has been followed previously?" Thea asked, examining the books. "Nothing formal," Mrs. Abernathy admitted. "The last teacher, Miss Holloway, did her best, but she wasn't trained like yourself. We're hoping you can bring some structure." "I'll certainly try," Thea promised, already mentally organizing lesson plans. After the tour, Judge Wilson escorted her back to the boarding house with instructions to rest before dinner at his home that evening. "The whole town's buzzing about your arrival," he told her with a grandfatherly smile. "Especially after hearing about your dramatic rescue. Roy Kincaid's never been the talk of the town before. He seemed quite private," Thea observed, recalling Mrs. Tillman's comments. "Roy's a man of few words, but solid as they come," the judge said approvingly. "Been foreman at the Triple Diamond for years now. He could run his own spread if he wanted to, but he seems content where he is." Back in her room, Thea rested briefly, then changed for dinner, selecting one of her better dresses, a deep blue that brought out her eyes. As she pinned up her honey-brown hair, she found herself wondering if she might encounter Roy in town before he returned to the ranch. Judge Wilson's home was the largest in Sweetwater, a 2-story clapboard house with a wide porch and carefully tended garden. The dinner was clearly meant to be an official welcome, with all 5 school board members present, along with the mayor and his wife. Thea answered questions about her background and educational philosophy, described her harrowing experience at Eagle Pass Canyon, carefully downplaying the terror she'd felt, and expressed enthusiasm about starting classes the following week. By the time dessert was served, she felt she had made a favorable impression. "We're fortunate to have someone of your caliber, Miss Blackburn," Mayor Collins said, raising his glass in a toast. "To Sweetwater's new teacher, may your stay with us be long and rewarding." Everyone drank to that, and Thea felt a surge of hope that perhaps, despite her inauspicious arrival, she could build a good life here. As the evening wound down, Thea found herself on the porch with Judge Wilson, enjoying the cooler night air. "You've charmed them all," he said with approval. "Even old Mrs. Abernathy, and she's not easily impressed." "Everyone has been very welcoming," Thea replied. "After yesterday's disaster, I wasn't sure what to expect," the judge chuckled. "We're a small town, Miss Blackburn, but we take care of our own, and you're one of us now." The walk back to the boarding house took them down the main street, now mostly quiet except for the saloon, from which piano music and raucous laughter emanated. Thea's steps slowed as she spotted a familiar figure emerging from the general store, Roy, carrying several packages. He saw them at the same moment and tipped his hat. "Evening, Judge, Miss Blackburn." "Kincaid," the judge greeted him warmly. "Just the man I wanted to see. Got a moment for you always." Roy's eyes flickered to Thea, a hint of warmth in their depths. "Miss Blackburn's settling in all right." "Please, I asked you to call me Thea," she reminded him. A smile touched his lips. "So you did. Roy, I've been meaning to talk to you about that piece of land adjoining the northeast corner of the Triple Diamond," the judge said. "The old Patterson place. What about it?" "It's coming up for auction next month. County seized it for back taxes. Might be worth considering since it controls access to that spring." Roy's expression grew thoughtful. "I'll mention it to Sheffield. Been trying to convince him to expand for years." "Do that," the judge said, then glanced at the darkening sky. "Well, I should get Miss Blackburn back to Mrs. Tillman's before it gets any later. Will you be at the social on Saturday?" "Hadn't planned on it," Roy admitted. "You should come," Thea found herself saying. "I'd welcome a familiar face." Something flickered in Roy's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "I'll consider it." They parted ways, Roy continuing toward the livery stable while the judge escorted Thea the remaining distance to the boarding house. As they walked, Thea found herself glancing back over her shoulder, watching Roy's tall figure recede into the gathering darkness. "He's a good man," the judge said quietly, noticing her gaze. "Keeps to himself, but salt of the earth." "So everyone keeps telling me," Thea replied, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Yet he seems to inspire quite a bit of curiosity." The judge chuckled. "Small towns run on gossip, Miss Blackburn. Roy's something of a mystery because he chooses to be. Came here 8 years ago, hardly more than a boy, worked his way up from ranch hand to foreman through sheer grit and intelligence. Never talks about his past, never courts any of the local girls, just does his job and keeps his own counsel. And that makes people suspicious. Curious, more like, but those who know him trust him." They had reached the boarding house, and the judge tipped his hat to her. "Rest well, Miss Blackburn. I suspect your first days in Sweetwater will be rather busy." That night, as Thea prepared for bed, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Roy Kincaid, the strength in his hand as he pulled her from certain death. The quiet confidence in his manner, the hint of mystery the judge had alluded to. She told herself it was natural to feel a connection to the man who had saved her life, nothing more than gratitude mingled with curiosity. Yet when she finally drifted off to sleep, it was his face she saw, those penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than she revealed. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Thea prepared for the start of school. She organized the schoolhouse, developed lesson plans, and met with parents and students who stopped by to introduce themselves. Word of her near-death experience at Eagle Pass Canyon had spread throughout town, lending her an almost mythical status among the children, who regarded her with wide-eyed fascination. "Is it true you dangled over the canyon by one hand, madam?" asked Tommy Peterson, the doctor's 10-year-old son, when he accompanied his mother to the schoolhouse. "Not exactly," Thea replied, smiling at his disappointed expression. "Mr. Kincaid caught me before I could fall that far. Pa says he's the best horseman in 3 counties," Tommy continued. "Says he could have been a ranger if he wanted." "Your father would know better than I," Thea said diplomatically, though she filed away this additional piece of information about her rescuer. By Saturday, Thea felt she had a reasonable grasp of what would be expected of her and was cautiously optimistic about beginning classes on Monday. The town's social that evening, held in the church meeting hall, would be her first opportunity to meet the entire community in a relaxed setting. Mrs. Tillman helped her dress for the occasion, lending her a lace shawl to drape over her shoulders. "You look lovely, dear," the older woman said approvingly. "You'll have every unmarried man in town falling at your feet." "I'm here to teach, Mrs. Tillman, not to find a husband," Thea reminded her. "One doesn't preclude the other," Mrs. Tillman replied with a knowing smile. "And speaking of eligible men, I noticed Roy Kincaid left yesterday without saying goodbye. Bit rude, considering." Thea felt a stab of disappointment. "He mentioned he had ranch business to attend to." "Did he now, Mrs.?" Tillman raised an eyebrow. "Well, the Triple Diamond does keep him busy, that's true enough." The social was already in full swing when they arrived, tables laden with food, a small group of local musicians playing lively tunes, and what seemed like the entire population of Sweetwater packed into the hall. Judge Wilson immediately came forward to greet Thea, introducing her to those she hadn't yet met. She danced with the judge, with Dr. Peterson, and with several other gentlemen, including the young bank clerk, who seemed particularly eager to impress her. Throughout the evening, she found herself scanning the room, looking for a familiar tall figure with dark hair, only to be disappointed each time. "Looking for someone in particular?" asked a voice at her elbow during a brief respite between dances. Thea turned to find Mrs. Abernathy regarding her shrewdly. "Just taking in the crowd," she replied, flushing slightly. "Roy Kincaid rarely attends these functions," the older woman said bluntly. "Too much socializing for his taste." Thea's blush deepened. "I wasn't, of course you were, dear, it's only natural. The man saved your life in dramatic fashion. Any woman would be curious." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened slightly. "But I feel obliged to warn you, Roy Kincaid is not the marrying kind. Many have tried to catch his eye over the years, all without success." "I assure you, Mrs. Abernathy, my interest is purely one of gratitude," Thea said stiffly. The older woman patted her arm. "Of course it is, dear, I meant no offense. Now, I believe young Mr. Harrison from the bank is hoping for another dance." Thea dutifully accepted Mr. Harrison's invitation, but her enjoyment of the evening had diminished. She felt both embarrassed that her interest in Roy was apparently so transparent and disappointed by his absence. It was foolish, she knew. She barely knew the man. As the evening wound down, Thea stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was clear and cool, stars blazing overhead in a way they never seemed to in Boston. She was admiring the view when a movement at the edge of the churchyard caught her eye. Roy Kincaid stood leaning against a tree, watching the proceedings from a distance, his hat pulled low over his eyes. When he saw her looking, he straightened and approached, his stride long and purposeful. "I thought you'd return to the ranch," Thea said when he reached her. "Got delayed in town." He gestured toward the hall. "Looks like a fine welcome." "It's been very pleasant," Thea agreed, "though I'm surprised to find you lurking in the shadows rather than joining in." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'm not much for crowds or dancing. Yet you came." His eyes met hers directly. "I said I'd consider it." Something in his steady gaze made Thea's heart beat faster. "Well, since you're here, would you care to walk with me? Mrs. Tillman is deep in conversation with the minister's wife and likely to be occupied for some time." Roy offered his arm without comment, and they strolled away from the church, down the quiet main street of Sweetwater. For several minutes neither spoke, the silence comfortable between them. "Have you recovered from your ordeal?" Roy finally asked. "Mostly," Thea admitted. Though I still wake sometimes thinking I'm falling. Roy nodded. That'll pass in time. The whole town seems to view me as some sort of tragic heroine, she said with a small laugh. The schoolteacher who nearly died before her first day. Could be worse, Roy observed dryly. Could be the schoolteacher who did die before her first day. Thea couldn't help but laugh, the sound ringing out in the quiet night. You have a unique way of putting things, Mr. Kincaid. Roy, he reminded her, a smile evident in his voice if not fully visible on his face. And I just call things as I see them. They had reached the end of the main street and turned to head back. The music from the social drifted faintly on the night air. Will you return to the ranch tomorrow? Thea asked. At first light, Roy confirmed. Cattle don't care it's Sunday. Thea felt a pang of regret that their paths would likely not cross again soon. Well, I'm glad I had the chance to see you before you left, to thank you again. You've thanked me enough, Roy said, his voice gentle. I was just in the right place at the right time. For me, that made all the difference in the world. They had reached the church hall again, and Roy stopped, turning to face her. In the spill of lamplight from the windows, his features were softer, less guarded than she'd seen them before. You'll do well here, Thea, he said quietly. Sweetwater's lucky to have you. Thank you, she replied, oddly touched by his confidence. Will I see you again? It's a small town, Roy said with a hint of a smile. I reckon our paths will cross. With that, he tipped his hat and melted back into the shadows, leaving Thea to return to the social, her mind full of questions about the enigmatic cowboy who had saved her life. The first day of school arrived, bringing with it the nervous excitement that always accompanied new beginnings. Thea stood at the door of the schoolhouse, welcoming her students as they arrived, farm children in clean but well-worn clothes, merchants' children in finer attire, all regarding her with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. By mid-morning, she had separated them into groups based on age and ability, set the older children to reading assignments while she worked with the younger ones on their letters. The day passed quickly, and by the time she rang the bell for dismissal, Thea felt a sense of accomplishment mingled with exhaustion. You survived, Judge Wilson observed, stopping by as the children streamed out into the afternoon sunshine. How did you find them? Bright and eager, Thea replied honestly, though some will need extra attention. The judge nodded approvingly. You've made a good start, Miss Blackburn. This town has needed someone like you. Days turned into weeks as Thea settled into the rhythm of Sweetwater. She came to know her students, their strengths and weaknesses, their family situations. She learned which merchants gave fair prices and which tried to overcharge the Eastern lady. She attended church on Sundays, joined the ladies' sewing circle, though her stitches were far from the finest, and gradually began to feel a part of the community. Throughout this time, she saw Roy Kincaid only occasionally a glimpse when he came to town for supplies, a brief exchange of greetings when they passed on the street. Each time her heart would beat a little faster, but their interactions remained polite and distant. Mrs. Tillman noticed, of course, and wasn't shy about commenting. That man is either blind or stubborn, she declared one evening as Thea helped with the dinner dishes. Probably both. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Thea replied, though her cheeks warmed. Of course you do, Mrs. Tillman said with a knowing look. Every unmarried man in town has come calling, and a few who shouldn't, and the one who caught your eye barely tips his hat when he sees you. Roy Kincaid did not catch my eye, Thea protested. He saved my life, and I'm grateful, that's all, Mrs. Tillman merely smiled and handed her another plate to dry. As autumn deepened, bringing cooler weather and earlier sunsets, Thea found herself thinking more and more about the approaching holidays. It would be her first Christmas without her father, in a town where she still sometimes felt like an outsider despite the general warmth of the community. One Friday afternoon in early November, as the children filed out of the schoolhouse, Thea noticed a familiar figure waiting at the edge of the schoolyard. Roy, astride his bay gelding, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Her heart skipped as she gathered her things and locked the schoolhouse door. When she approached, Roy dismounted, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that somehow touched her deeply. Mr. Kincaid, she greeted him, aware of curious gazes from passing townspeople. This is a surprise. Miss Blackburn, he replied, his voice low. I was hoping to have a word if you've got the time. Of course. She fell into step beside him as he led his horse down the street toward the boarding house. Is everything all right at the ranch? Ranch is fine. He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. Judge Wilson mentioned you were asking about transportation to Eagle Pass Canyon. Thought I should inquire why you'd want to return there. Thea blinked in surprise. I was hoping to recover more of my belongings. The judge said with the right equipment, it might be possible to reach the bottom of the canyon where the rest of my wagon fell. Roy's expression darkened. It's dangerous terrain, especially with winter coming on, not a journey to undertake lightly. I'm aware of the risks, Thea said, lifting her chin. But there are things I lost that day that can't be replaced. My mother's locket, my father's watch, family letters, sentimental items, Roy interrupted. Not worth risking your life. That's not for you to decide, Thea replied, stung by his dismissal. They may mean nothing to you, but they're all I have left of my family. Roy was silent for a moment, studying her with those penetrating eyes. Finally, he sighed. When were you planning to go? This Sunday, Thea said, surprised by the question. Mr. Harrison from the bank offered to take me in his buckboard. Roy's jaw tightened visibly. Harrison doesn't know the canyon. First rain could wash him and you right over the edge. He shook his head. If you're set on going, I'll take you. Thea felt a surge of hope. You will, but I think it's foolhardy, Roy confirmed. But better me than Harrison. I know that terrain, know where it's safe to descend and where it isn't. Thank you, Thea said softly. It means a great deal to me, Roy nodded once, settling his hat back on his head. I'll come for you Sunday at first light. Dress warm, bring food, it'll be a long day. With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Thea to wonder at the sudden turn of events. Sunday dawned clear but cold, with frost silvering the grass and rooftops of Sweetwater. Thea was ready when Roy arrived, dressed in her warmest clothes, a small bundle of food prepared with Mrs. Tillman's help. You be careful now, the older woman cautioned as Thea prepared to leave. That canyon's no place for a lady. I'll be fine with Roy, Thea assured her, ignoring the knowing look that passed across Mrs. Tillman's face. Roy was waiting outside with 2 horses, his bay gelding and a gentle-looking mare. Thought it would be easier than a wagon, he explained, helping Thea mount. The trail gets narrow in places. The ride to Eagle Pass Canyon took most of the morning, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as they left Sweetwater behind. Roy rode mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Thea had come to understand that he was a man who spoke when he had something to say, not to fill the air with empty words. When they reached the canyon rim, not far from where her wagon had gone over, Thea felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Roy must have sensed her distress, for he reined in beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. We don't have to do this, he said quietly. No one would think less of you for turning back. Thea straightened her spine. I would think less of myself. I need to try, Roy, he nodded, respect evident in his eyes. There's a trail about half a mile south that leads down to the canyon floor. It's steep but manageable if we take it slow. The descent was more harrowing than Thea had anticipated, the trail little more than a narrow track winding down the canyon wall. Roy went first, his horse picking its way carefully, while Thea followed, concentrating on keeping her mount calm and sure-footed. By the time they reached the canyon floor, the sun was high overhead, casting short shadows on the rocky ground. Roy dismounted and helped Thea down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. We'll rest the horses a bit, then head north, he said, tying the animals to a scraggly bush. The wagon wreckage should be about a quarter-mile that way, based on where you went over. They shared a simple lunch of cold biscuits, jerky, and apples, sitting on sun-warmed rocks. Thea found herself studying Roy's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sun brought out hints of red in his dark hair. When he caught her looking, she didn't glance away, meeting his gaze steadily. Why did you really agree to bring me here? She asked. Roy considered the question, taking his time as he always did. Figured if you were determined to come, better with someone who knows the terrain. And he hesitated, then continued, I feel responsible in a way. Responsible, you saved my life. And if I'd been a few minutes earlier, I might have warned you about the unstable edge before your wagon got too close. His expression was grave. You lost nearly everything that day. If I can help recover even a small part of it, I owe you that much. Thea was touched by his sense of honor, so at odds with the casual way most men she'd known viewed their obligations. You owe me nothing, Roy. If anything, the debt is entirely mine. He shook his head slightly, but said nothing more, rising to his feet. We should get moving if we want to be back before dark. Finding the wreckage of Thea's wagon proved easier than expected. The distinctive pieces of painted wood were scattered across a section of the canyon floor, along with the contents that had been inside clothing, books, and personal items strewn among the rocks like discarded toys. Thea felt a lump form in her throat as she surveyed the scene. Roy, noting her distress, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Take your time, he said quietly. I'll start gathering what looks salvageable. They worked methodically through the debris, Thea exclaiming in delight when she found her mother's silver locket, miraculously intact, and again when Roy extracted her father's pocket watch from beneath a splintered board. Letters, photographs, a small music box piece by piece, they recovered the tangible remnants of Thea's past. Thank you, she said softly as Roy carefully wrapped her mother's porcelain figurine in a scrap of cloth. This means more than I can say. He glanced up, and something in his expression made her breath catch a warmth, a connection that transcended mere acquaintance or even friendship. Your past matters, he said simply. Everyone's does. They continued searching until they'd recovered all they could reasonably carry, packing the items into saddlebags and a small sack Roy had brought for the purpose. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western rim of the canyon by the time they finished. We should head back, Roy said, eyeing the lengthening shadows with concern. Don't want to be climbing that trail in darkness. As they prepared to leave, Thea took one last look at the scattered remains of her wagon. It's strange, she said thoughtfully. A week ago, I would have said losing these things was the worst tragedy of my life. Now I realize they're just that, things. Important, yes, but not worth the grief I gave them. Roy studied her for a moment. Sometimes it takes losing something to understand its true value. And sometimes, Thea replied softly, what you find is worth more than what you lost. Their eyes met and held, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Then Roy cleared his throat and turned to help her mount her horse, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The climb back to the canyon rim was arduous, the trail seeming steeper and more treacherous than it had on the descent. Thea's mare stumbled once, sending a shower of pebbles cascading down the slope and causing Thea's heart to lurch in fear. Roy was off his horse in an instant, steadying her mount with quiet words and a firm hand. Easy, he murmured, as much to Thea as to the horse. You're all right. By the time they reached the top, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and golds. Thea paused to catch her breath and admire the view, the beauty of it momentarily overwhelming her fears. It's magnificent, she said, gesturing toward the sunset. I've never seen colors like that in Boston. That's Texas for you, Roy replied, a hint of pride in his voice. Beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. They rode back toward Sweetwater in companionable silence, the recovered treasures secure in their packs, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Thea felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before her father's death, a sense that perhaps she had found where she belonged. As the lights of town appeared in the distance, Roy slowed his horse, turning to face her. I've been meaning to ask, how are you finding Sweetwater? Is it what you expected? Thea considered the question seriously. It's different, she admitted. Smaller, rougher in some ways, but the people have been kind for the most part and the children are eager to learn. I think I could be happy here. Roy nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Good, town needs someone like you, someone with perspective. Is that what I have? Thea asked, smiling slightly. Perspective, you've seen more of the world than most folks here, Roy pointed out. Brings a different way of looking at things. And what about you? Thea found herself asking. What's your perspective, Roy Kincaid? Everyone in town seems to have an opinion about you, but no one seems to really know you. Roy was quiet for a long moment, and Thea feared she had overstepped. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than offended. I came to Texas running from something, he said, his eyes on the horizon. Doesn't matter what now, it was long ago and far away. Found that out here, a man is judged more by what he does than where he came from or who his people were. He glanced at her. That suited me fine, and does it still? Thea pressed gently. Being alone, keeping people at a distance, Roy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. It did. Until recently. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Thea felt her heart quicken, but before she could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, a group of men from town, led by young Mr. Harrison from the bank. Miss Blackburn. Harrison called, relief evident in his voice as he reined in his horse. We were just coming to look for you. Mrs. Tillman was worried when you didn't return by sunset. As you can see, Mr. Harrison, I'm perfectly fine, Thea replied, noting the way Roy had withdrawn, his expression once again unreadable. Mr. Kincaid was kind enough to escort me to Eagle Pass Canyon and back. Harrison eyed Roy with poorly disguised suspicion. Well, we're here now. We can see you safely back to town. That won't be necessary, Roy said, his voice cool. We're nearly there already. An awkward silence fell, broken only when one of the other men, Dr. Peterson, Thea now recognized, spoke up. Let's all ride back together, shall we? Getting cold out here. The return to Sweetwater was strained, with Harrison positioning himself between Thea and Roy, chattering about town business and the upcoming Thanksgiving celebration. Roy said nothing, his face impassive, though Thea caught him watching her once or twice with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. At the boarding house, Roy dismounted to help Thea down, his hands gentle but impersonal at her waist. Harrison hovered nearby, clearly impatient to assert his own claim to her attention. Thank you for today, Thea said quietly to Roy as he handed her the saddlebag containing her recovered treasures. For everything, Roy touched the brim of his hat. My pleasure, Miss Blackburn. The formality stung after the connection they had shared at the canyon, but Thea understood. With witnesses present, especially ones as eager to misinterpret as Mr. Harrison, Roy was retreating behind the reserve that had served him so well in Sweetwater. Good night, Mr. Kincaid, she said, matching his formality while trying to convey with her eyes what she couldn't say aloud. I hope we'll meet again soon. A flicker of warmth in his gaze was her only answer before he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving her with Harrison and the others, all curious about her day's adventure. That night, as Thea carefully arranged her recovered possessions in her room, she found herself thinking of Roy's words. It did. Until recently. What had he meant? Was he, like her, feeling this unexpected connection that seemed to deepen each time they met? She fell asleep with these questions circling in her mind, and dreamed not of falling, but of being caught, held secure in strong arms while the world tumbled away beneath her feet. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a blur of school activities and community preparations for the holiday. Thea threw herself into her teaching duties, organizing a small pageant for the children to perform for their parents, complete with historical readings and songs about the first Thanksgiving. She saw little of Roy during this time, according to town gossip relayed faithfully by Mrs. Tillman. He was busy with Triple Diamond business, making trips to San Antonio to arrange cattle sales for the spring. Thea told herself she wasn't disappointed by his absence, that whatever moment they had shared at the canyon was probably nothing more than gratitude on her part and kindness on his. Yet she found her eyes scanning the street whenever she walked to and from the schoolhouse, hoping for a glimpse of his tall figure. Thanksgiving arrived with a rare cold snap, frost silvering the windows of the boarding house when Thea awoke. She dressed carefully for church, selecting a deep burgundy dress that Mrs. Abernathy had helped her remake from one of her Boston gowns. The service was well attended, the small church filled to capacity with families in their Sunday best. Thea sat with Mrs. Tillman and several other boarding house residents, trying not to be obvious as she glanced around for any sign of Roy. "He's there," Mrs. Tillman whispered, noticing her wandering gaze. "Back corner with Mr. Sheffield." Thea flushed at being so transparent but couldn't help stealing a look in the direction Mrs. Tillman indicated. Sure enough, Roy sat beside his employer, looking uncomfortable but dignified in a clean black coat, his hair neatly combed beneath his hat. As if sensing her gaze, he glanced up, their eyes meeting across the crowded church. Thea offered a small smile, which he returned with a slight nod before returning his attention to the minister. After the service, the entire town gathered in the meeting hall for a community Thanksgiving feast. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted turkeys, hams, and all manner of side dishes and desserts brought by the townspeople. Children darted between the tables, excited by the holiday and the prospect of sweets, while the adults mingled, catching up on news and gossip. Thea found herself surrounded by well-wishers, parents thanking her for her work with their children, especially the Thanksgiving pageant, which had been performed the day before. She accepted their praise graciously, all the while aware of Roy's presence across the room, where he stood with Mr. Sheffield and several other ranchers, deep in conversation. "He keeps looking at you, you know," said a voice at her elbow. Thea turned to find Judge Wilson regarding her with kindly amusement. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she replied, though she couldn't prevent a slight blush from rising to her cheeks. "Roy," the judge clarified unnecessarily, "man's barely taken his eyes off you since you walked in." Thea glanced involuntarily in Roy's direction and found, to her embarrassment, that he was indeed watching her, though he quickly looked away when their eyes met. "I think you're mistaken, Judge," she said, smoothing her skirts. "Mr. Kincaid and I are merely acquaintances." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Word around town is you two spent a whole day alone together at Eagle Pass Canyon." "He was kind enough to help me recover some personal belongings," Thea explained, trying to keep her voice level. "Nothing more, if you say so." The judge didn't look convinced. "Though I will say, in all the years I've known Roy Kincaid, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Before Thea could formulate a response, they were interrupted by Mayor Collins calling for everyone's attention to say the blessing before the meal. As people began to find seats at the long tables, Thea found herself maneuvered by Mrs. Tillman to a spot that, not coincidentally, had an empty chair beside it. "Sheffield always sits with the ranchers at the other end," the older woman whispered conspiratorially, "but his foreman's on his own." Sure enough, as people settled into their places, Roy appeared, looking somewhat at a loss until Mrs. Tillman waved him over with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Mr. Kincaid, we've saved you a seat right here beside our Miss Blackburn." Roy hesitated, glancing at Thea as if seeking permission. She nodded slightly, hoping her face didn't betray her suddenly racing heart. "Mrs. Tillman," he acknowledged as he took the offered seat. "Miss Blackburn, Mr. Kincaid," Thea replied, equally formal. "Happy Thanksgiving, and to you." His voice softened slightly. "You look well." "Thank you, as do you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Mrs. Tillman, clearly exasperated, thrust a platter of turkey in their direction. "For heaven's sake, you two, it's a holiday. You can at least pass the food without looking like you're at a funeral." That startled a laugh from Thea and even brought a hint of a smile to Roy's lips. As they began to serve themselves from the various dishes being passed around, the tension eased slightly. "I heard your students put on quite a show yesterday," Roy said, surprising Thea with the initiative. The Peterson boy wouldn't stop talking about it when his father brought him by the livery. "They worked very hard," Thea replied, pleased that he'd heard about it. "Tommy played the part of Governor Bradford. He has quite a flair for the dramatic. Takes after his mother," Roy observed dryly. "Mrs. Peterson can turn a simple headache into a performance worthy of the finest theater in New York." Thea couldn't help laughing, and just like that, the ice was broken. They conversed easily through the meal, discussing the school, the ranch, the town's preparations for Christmas. Roy, Thea discovered, was surprisingly well-informed about a wide range of topics, from current events to literature, though he downplayed his knowledge with self-deprecating humor. "My mother taught me to read before I was 5, he admitted when Thea expressed surprise at his familiarity with Dickens. Said books were the one thing that couldn't be taken from a man long as he kept his eyes and his mind. She sounds like a wise woman, Thea said softly. Is she still living? A shadow passed over Roy's face. No, lost her when I was 16, my father earlier still. I'm sorry. Thea hesitated, then added, it's still fresh for me losing my father. Some days I can barely believe he's gone. Roy's eyes met hers, understanding and empathy evident in their depths. It gets easier, he said quietly. Not better exactly, but less raw. You learn to live with the empty space. His insight touched Thea deeply. Here was someone who truly understood loss, who didn't try to minimize it with platitudes about time healing all wounds or her father being in a better place. Just simple acknowledgement of the reality, that grief changed shape but never truly vanished. The moment was interrupted by Mr. Harrison, who appeared at Thea's other side, practically vibrating with eagerness. Miss Blackburn, I've been looking all over for you. We're organizing some games after the meal, and I was hoping you'd be my partner for the three-legged race. Thea blinked, taken aback by the abrupt change in tone and topic. That's very kind, Mr. Harrison, but come now, he pressed, either missing or ignoring her reluctance. It's all in good fun, and everyone's participating. Before Thea could formulate a polite refusal, Roy spoke up. Actually, Harrison, Miss Blackburn already agreed to be my partner. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable note of authority. Isn't that right, Thea? The use of her first name, so deliberate and intimate, sent a shiver down Thea's spine. That's right, she confirmed, meeting Roy's gaze with silent gratitude. I'm afraid I'm already spoken for. Harrison's face fell, then hardened with barely concealed resentment. I see, well, perhaps another time. He nodded stiffly and walked away, his back rigid with wounded pride. You didn't have to do that, Thea said once he was out of earshot, though I appreciate the rescue. Harrison's been making his intentions clear since the day you arrived, Roy replied. Figured you might welcome an excuse to avoid being literally tied to him, even temporarily. And what about you? Thea asked, emboldened by his intervention. Are you actually planning to participate in these games, or was that just a convenient fabrication? A slow smile spread across Roy's face, transforming his features in a way that made Thea's breath catch. I reckon I'm committed now, he said. Unless you'd prefer to withdraw, not at all, Thea replied, returning his smile. Though I should warn you, I'm very competitive. Somehow that doesn't surprise me in the least, Miss Blackburn. The afternoon proceeded with various holiday games and activities, sack races, bobbing for apples, and yes, the three-legged race which Thea and Roy entered together, much to the evident surprise of the townspeople. They didn't win that honor went to Dr. Peterson and his wife, who had clearly practiced, but they finished respectably, laughing as they crossed the line, arms around each other's waists for stability. Not bad for a first attempt, Roy said as they untied the cloth binding their legs together. His hand lingered briefly on her ankle, the touch sending warmth spreading through Thea despite the layers of stockings and boots between them. Perhaps we should practice for next year, she suggested without thinking, then blushed as she realized the implication that they would still be together in whatever capacity a year from now. Roy regarded her thoughtfully, something softening in his expression. Perhaps we should. As the day waned and families began to depart for their homes, Thea found herself reluctant for it to end. She had enjoyed Roy's company more than she cared to admit, and the thought of returning to her solitary room at the boarding house seemed suddenly lonely. Roy must have sensed her mood, for as she was preparing to leave with Mrs. Tillman, he approached, hat in hand. I wonder if you might care for a walk, Miss Blackburn, he said formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the stiffness of his words. Evening's fine, and it might be pleasant to see the town by moonlight. Mrs. Tillman beamed with barely concealed delight. What a lovely idea. You young people enjoy yourselves. Don't worry about me. I'll walk back with Mrs. Peterson. Before Thea could protest this transparent matchmaking, the older woman had hurried off, leaving her alone with Roy. You don't have to accompany me if you'd rather not, Roy said quietly. Mrs. Tillman can be enthusiastic. I'd like to walk with you, Thea replied honestly. Very much. The night was clear and cold, stars sharp against the velvet sky, their breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. They walked slowly down the main street, Roy shortening his stride to match hers, both of them content to be silent for a time. I've been thinking about what you said, Roy finally spoke, at the canyon about things not being worth the grief you gave them. Yes, it stayed with me. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Made me wonder what else I might have been giving too much weight to. What I might have been missing while looking backward instead of forward. Thea's heart quickened. And have you reached any conclusions? Roy stopped walking, turning to face her directly, moonlight silvering his features. I think perhaps I've been a fool, he said softly. Keeping to myself, telling myself it was simpler that way, safer. Safer than what? Thea asked, barely breathing. Than this. His hand rose to touch her cheek, so gently it might have been the brush of a moth's wing. Than feeling something I can't control or predict. Than caring for someone who might not care back. Roy, Thea whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. I do care. The words hung in the frosty air between them, honest and unadorned. For a moment neither moved, the connection between them fragile as spun glass. Then Roy leaned down, slowly enough that Thea could have withdrawn if she wished, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, but as Thea responded, rising on her toes to deepen the contact, it transformed into something more urgent, more profound. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Roy rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since I pulled you up from that canyon edge, he admitted. Maybe even before, when I first saw you hanging there, looking more indignant than afraid. Thea laughed softly. I was terrified, but also furious at my own stupidity for getting so close to the edge. That's what struck me, Roy said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Most people would have just screamed or fainted. You were already figuring out how to save yourself. I wasn't doing a very good job of it, Thea pointed out. If you hadn't come along, but I did. His voice was fervent. And I'm beginning to think that was the luckiest moment of my life, not yours. They walked on, hand in hand now, the town quiet around them, most households already settled in for the evening. When they reached the boarding house, Roy paused at the foot of the steps, clearly reluctant to end their time together. Will I see you tomorrow? Thea asked, equally unwilling to say goodnight. I have to return to the ranch, Roy said regretfully. Been away too long as it is, but I could ride back Sunday if you'd like. I would like that very much. Thea hesitated, then added, perhaps you could join me for dinner, Mrs. Tillman always cooks too much on Sundays. Roy smiled, that transformative expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. I'd be honored. He kissed her once more, briefly but with a promise of more to come, then watched as she climbed the steps to the boarding house door. Thea turned back for one last look, finding him still there, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlit street. Good night, Roy, she called softly. Good night, Thea, he replied. Sweet dreams. And for the first time since the accident, Thea's dreams were indeed sweet, filled not with falling but with flying, soaring over the Texas landscape with Roy beside her, both of them free and unafraid. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed in a whirlwind of activity. Thea was busy with school preparations for the holiday, while Roy's duties at the ranch kept him equally occupied. Yet despite their responsibilities, they managed to carve out time for each other's Sunday dinners at the boarding house, occasional walks in the evenings when Roy could stay in town. And once, a memorable ride out to the Triple Diamond so Thea could see the place Roy called home, Mrs. Tillman, predictably, was delighted by the developing romance, though she tried unsuccessfully to hide her matchmaking satisfaction. The rest of the town reacted with varying degrees of surprise and interest. Some, like Judge Wilson and Dr. Peterson, seemed genuinely pleased. Others, particularly Mr. Harrison, were visibly disappointed or even resentful. "Don't pay them any mind," Roy advised when Thea mentioned some of the cooler reactions she'd received. "Small towns run on gossip, but they adjust to change eventually. They'll get used to seeing us together." "Is that what we are?" Thea asked, a teasing note in her voice. Together, they were sitting on the boarding house porch enjoying a rare mild December evening. Roy turned to face her, his expression serious despite her light tone. "I'd like us to be," he said quietly. "If that's what you want too." Thea felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "It is," she confirmed, "very much so." Roy's smile was soft and private, meant only for her. "Good, that's settled then." As Christmas approached, the school closed for a 2-week holiday, giving Thea more free time than she'd had since arriving in Sweetwater. Roy, however, found his duties increasing as the Triple Diamond prepared for the harsh winter months ahead. "Sheffield's thinking of buying that Patterson land the judge mentioned," he told Thea during one of their Sunday dinners. "Asked me to ride out and assess the potential." "When would you go?" Thea asked, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. She had been looking forward to spending Christmas with Roy, her first holiday since her father's death. "Day after tomorrow," Roy replied. "Be gone 3, maybe 4 days, should be back well before Christmas Eve." "Well, that's something, at least." Thea smiled to show she understood. "I'll save all my Christmas preparations for when you return. Mrs. Tillman has promised to teach me how to make proper mincemeat pies." Roy reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised. "This Christmas. It matters to me, Thea, being with you." The simple admission touched her deeply. "It matters to me too." 2 days later, Thea stood on the boarding house porch, watching as Roy prepared to depart for his assessment of the Patterson land. The morning was cold, a biting wind sweeping down from the north, carrying the scent of approaching snow. "You'll be careful?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "The weather looks like it might turn." "Always am," Roy assured her, checking the cinch on his saddle one last time. "Been riding these parts for years. I know when to seek shelter and when to press on." Thea nodded, knowing his experience was far greater than hers in these matters. Still, she couldn't shake a vague sense of unease as she watched him mount his horse. 3 days, she reminded him. "Don't be late, or Mrs. Tillman will send out a search party. She's very invested in our Christmas plans." Roy laughed, the sound warming Thea despite the cold wind. "Wouldn't dare disappoint Mrs. Tillman," he promised. "Or you." He leaned down from the saddle, and Thea rose on her toes to meet him, their lips touching briefly but tenderly. 3 days, Roy confirmed. "I'll be back before you know it." With that, he urged his horse forward, raising a hand in farewell as he rode out of town. Thea watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned back into the boarding house, telling herself the hollow feeling in her chest was foolish. He would be back soon enough. The first day of Roy's absence passed uneventfully. Thea kept busy helping Mrs. Tillman with Christmas baking, visiting some of her students who lived in town, and writing letters to old friends in Boston, describing her new life in Sweetwater with a happiness that surprised even herself. The second day, the weather took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in from the north, and by mid-afternoon, snow was falling heavily, driven by a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the boarding house. "My old bones say this is going to be a bad one, Mrs. Tillman declared, peering out at the rapidly accumulating snow. "Good thing we're well stocked, might be snowed in for a day or two." Thea couldn't help glancing toward the window, concern for Roy growing as the storm intensified. "Do you think Roy will be all right out there, Mrs. Tillman patted her arm reassuringly. "That young man knows this country better than most. If the weather's bad, he'll find shelter and wait it out. Don't you worry." But Thea did worry, especially when the third day dawned with the storm still raging. Snow now piled against the lower windows of the boarding house, the wind howling like a living thing through the streets of Sweetwater. By evening, with no sign of the storm abating and no word from Roy, her concern had deepened to genuine fear. He should have been back by now. she said to Mrs. Tillman as they sat in the parlor, trying to focus on their needlework while the storm raged outside. What if he's hurt or lost? Now, the older woman soothed, though Thea could see worry in her eyes as well. Roy's not the type to take foolish risks. He's likely holed up somewhere warm, waiting for the storm to break. But what if he isn't? Thea pressed, unable to shake her growing dread. What if he tried to make it back and got caught in the open? Before Mrs. Tillman could respond, there was a commotion at the front door, stomping boots, voices raised in greeting, and then, to Thea's immense relief, a familiar deep tone among them. She was on her feet and across the room before she quite realized she was moving, flinging open the parlor door to find Roy in the entrance hall, covered in snow, his face reddened from the cold but very much alive. "Roy," she exclaimed, heedless of propriety as she threw herself into his arms. "Thank God you're safe." Roy held her close, his coat cold and wet against her cheek, but his arms strong and secure around her. "Told you I'd be back," he murmured into her hair. "Though I'll admit, it was a closer thing than I'd have liked." Once Roy had been relieved of his snow-covered outer garments and installed before the fire with a cup of hot coffee, liberally laced with whiskey by Mrs. Tillman, who then discreetly retired to give them privacy. He explained his harrowing journey. "Storm caught me on the way back," he said, still shivering slightly despite the fire's warmth. "Had to shelter in an abandoned line shack for a day and a night. When it showed no signs of letting up, I figured I'd better try to make it back before the drifts got any deeper." "You could have frozen to death," Thea said, her voice shaking slightly as she imagined him struggling through the blinding snow. "Or gotten lost." Roy's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "But I didn't. I'm here, safe and sound, just like I promised." Thea leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "All I could think was that I'd lost you before I'd even had the chance to tell you." She trailed off, suddenly shy despite everything they'd shared. "Tell me what?" Roy prompted softly. Thea took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "That I love you," she said, looking up to meet his gaze directly. "I know it hasn't been long, and perhaps it's too soon to say such things, but the thought of losing you made me realize I couldn't bear it if you didn't know." For a moment, Roy was perfectly still, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, warming his features in a way that not even the fire could match. "It's not too soon," he said, his voice low and fervent. "Not for me. I've loved you since that day at the canyon when you looked death in the face and didn't blink. I just never thought a woman like you could feel the same for someone like me." "A woman like me?" Thea echoed, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Roy shrugged slightly, a hint of the old reserve creeping back into his expression. "Educated, cultured, from a good family, despite your recent hardships. You could have your pick of men, Thea, men with more to offer than a foreman's wages and a past better left buried." "Roy Kincaid," Thea said firmly, taking his face between her hands. "The man I love is the one sitting before me now. The one who saved my life, who helped me recover pieces of my past, who looks at me as if I'm something precious rather than just a suitable match. I don't care about your past or your wages. I care about you." Roy's response was to pull her into his arms, his kiss conveying what words alone could not: the depth of his feelings, the intensity of his relief at her acceptance, the promise of a future together. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Roy reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in oilskin. "I was going to save this for Christmas," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "but after today, I don't want to wait." Thea unwrapped the oilskin to find a small wooden box, beautifully carved with wildflowers. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a ring, a simple gold band set with a single small diamond that caught the firelight and reflected it in tiny rainbows. "It was my mother's," Roy explained softly. "The one thing I kept when I left home. She told me to give it to the woman who captured my heart when I found her." He took Thea's hand in his. "I never thought I would until you." Tears welled in Thea's eyes as she understood what he was asking. "Roy, are you asking you to be my wife?" "Yes, I am." His voice was steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know it's soon, and I know I'm not the husband your father might have wished for you, but I love you, Thea Blackburn, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making you happy if you'll have me." Thea felt as if her heart might burst with joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll have you, Roy Kincaid. I'll be your wife." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, the gold warm against her skin. Roy gathered her into his arms again, his kiss tender yet possessing a new certainty, a promise sealed between them when Mrs. Tillman discovered them thus a short time later. She didn't even pretend to be scandalized, merely clapped her hands in delight at the news of their engagement and hurried off to prepare a celebratory supper, muttering about having known all along that they were perfect for each other. The days that followed were among the happiest of Thea's life. The storm passed, leaving Sweetwater transformed into a winter wonderland, the snow softening the harsh lines of the frontier town. News of their engagement spread quickly, met with congratulations from most quarters and resigned acceptance from the few who might have wished otherwise. Judge Wilson insisted on hosting an engagement party, bringing together the town's leading citizens to celebrate. Even Mr. Sheffield rode in from the Triple Diamond, clearly pleased that his foreman had found happiness. "Never thought I'd see the day," the older man confided to Thea during the party. "Roy's been like a son to me, but always kept part of himself closed off." "You've opened something in him, Miss Blackburn, done what none of us could." "He's done the same for me," Thea replied honestly. "Given me a home here, a sense of belonging I wasn't sure I'd ever find again after my father died." Christmas arrived in a flurry of celebrations, the school pageant, which Thea directed despite being on holiday, church services, and private gatherings in homes throughout town. Roy, temporarily released from his ranch duties, stayed at Judge Wilson's house in town, spending his days with Thea and making plans for their future. "Sheffield's offered us a place at the Triple Diamond," he told her on Christmas Eve as they walked back from the church service, snow crunching beneath their boots. "A small house that used to belong to the previous foreman. It needs work, but it could be a good start for us." "It sounds perfect," Thea said, squeezing his arm where it was linked with hers. "Though I'll need to finish the school year before we can marry, I promised the board." "I know," Roy assured her. "I'm in no rush, Thea." "Well, that's not entirely true," he amended with a smile. "I'd marry you tomorrow if I could, but I can wait until summer if that's what's needed." Thea leaned her head against his shoulder as they walked, contentment spreading through her like warmth from a fire. "Just think," she mused, "if my wagon hadn't gone over that cliff, we might never have met." Roy stopped walking, turning to face her, snowflakes catching in his dark hair and on his eyelashes. "I've thought about that," he admitted, "how something so terrifying could lead to the greatest happiness of my life." "Do you believe in fate, Roy?" Thea asked, her face tilted up to his. "That some things are meant to be, regardless of how unlikely they seem." Roy considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I don't know about fate," he said finally, "but I do know that in a lifetime of wandering, I never felt at home anywhere until I found you. So whether it was fate, chance, or just plain luck that brought you to that canyon edge and me riding by at that exact moment, I'll be grateful for it every day of my life." He kissed her then, soft and sweet beneath the falling snow, and Thea knew with absolute certainty that whatever had brought them together, fate, chance, or providence, she too would be eternally grateful. Summer, 1875. The wildflowers bloomed across the Texas landscape in a riot of color, painting the rolling hills with blue bonnets, Indian paintbrush, and Mexican hat. Thea stood at the window of her room in the boarding house, watching as the town of Sweetwater prepared for the wedding that would take place in just a few hours. The past months had passed in a whirlwind of activity. Thea had completed her first year of teaching, renewing her contract with the school board for the following term, though she would now be Mrs. Kincaid rather than Miss Blackburn. Roy had divided his time between his duties at the Triple Diamond and renovating the small house that would be their home, making improvements that Thea had only seen glimpses of during chaperoned visits. Now, as Mrs. Tillman helped her into her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk that Judge Wilson had insisted on ordering from San Antonio. As his gift to them, Thea felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found her place in the world against all odds. "You look beautiful, dear Mrs. Tillman said, securing the last of the tiny pearl buttons down Thea's back. "Roy won't know what hit him," Thea smiled, thinking of her soon-to-be husband. In the months since their engagement, their love had only deepened, growing from the initial spark of attraction and gratitude into something solid and enduring, built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine understanding. There had been challenges, of course. The remnants of Roy's reserve sometimes surfaced when the topic of his past arose. Though he had gradually shared more of his history with Thea, his difficult childhood with a father who drank too much and used his fists too freely, his mother's unwavering love and protection, the circumstances that had led him to leave home at 16 after her death. "I had to get away," he'd explained one quiet evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. "My father, he wasn't always a bad man, but grief changed him, made him dangerous. The night after we buried my mother, he came at me with a hunting knife, blamed me for not being able to save her." Roy's eyes had been distant with memory. "I defended myself. He ended up with the knife in his shoulder. I took what little money my mother had hidden away and ran. Never went back." Thea had held him as he spoke, understanding now why he kept so much of himself hidden from others. To have endured such pain and still become the man he was, honorable, kind, steadfast, spoke to a strength of character that only increased her admiration and love. For her part, Thea had shared her own painful history, her father's increasing desperation as his investments failed, his final illness hastened, she believed, by shame and worry, and her own journey from protected daughter to independent woman, forced by circumstance to make her own way in the world. These shared confidences had created a bond between them that transcended the physical attraction and emotional connection they'd felt from the beginning. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and accepted what they found there without judgment. A knock at the door interrupted Thea's reflections. Judge Wilson stood in the hallway, resplendent in his best suit, ready to escort her to the church in the absence of her father. "It's time, my dear," he said, offering his arm. "Your young man is waiting, and if we delay much longer, I fear he might come looking for you himself." Thea took his arm, gathering her courage along with her skirts. "Then we mustn't keep him waiting." The church was filled to capacity when Thea entered on Judge Wilson's arm. Every resident of Sweetwater, it seemed, had turned out for the wedding of their schoolteacher and the Triple Diamond's foreman. Flowers decorated every surface, their sweet fragrance filling the air, but Thea saw none of it. Her eyes were fixed on Roy, standing tall and straight at the altar, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to wonder as she walked toward him. He looked different in his new suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaven, but his eyes were the same steady, true, filled with love as they met hers. When Judge Wilson placed her hand in Roy's, Thea felt the familiar strength in his grip, the calloused palm that had once caught her as she fell now holding hers with infinite tenderness. "You're beautiful," Roy whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "So are you," Thea replied softly, meaning it from the depths of her heart. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear, promises made with full awareness of their weight and significance. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Roy's kiss was both reverent and possessive, a perfect balance that made Thea's heart sing. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and more good wishes than Thea could count. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows of the meeting hall, Roy led her outside for a moment of quiet amid the festivities. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist, holding her close against the cooling evening air. "More than I ever thought possible," Thea assured him, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" Roy's answer was to kiss her slow and deep, his hands framing her face with exquisite care. "I have everything I never dared to hope for," he said when they parted. "A beautiful wife, a home, a future that looks brighter than any I could have imagined. Their new home at the Triple Diamond was revealed to Thea that night, a cozy house transformed by Roy's hard work and attention to detail. The main room boasted shelves for her books, curtains at the windows, and comfortable furniture that managed to combine practicality with beauty. The bedroom held a large brass bed, a wedding gift from Mr. Sheffield, and a dressing table that Roy had made himself, polished to a soft glow in the lamplight. "It's perfect," Thea breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Roy, it's absolutely perfect." "Not quite," Roy said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "There's one more thing." He led her to a small second bedroom, opening the door to reveal a space painted in soft yellow, furnished with a rocking chair and a small desk. On the desk sat a wooden cradle, exquisitely carved with the same wildflower pattern as the box that had held her engagement ring. "I know we haven't talked much about children," Roy said, watching her face carefully. "And maybe it's presumptuous of me to assume, but I thought someday maybe." Thea couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Instead, she threw her arms around him, pouring all her love and gratitude into a kiss that left them both breathless. "I take it you approve," Roy said when they finally came up for air, his smile tender as he brushed away the happy tears that had escaped to trail down her cheeks. "I more than approve," Thea assured him. "I've dreamed of having a family with you, Roy. Of building a life here, watching our children grow up in this beautiful place." The tenderness in Roy's eyes deepened to something more heated as he swept her into his arms. "Well then, Mrs. Kincaid," he said, his voice low and intimate, "perhaps we should begin that particular journey sooner rather than later." He carried her to their bedroom, laying her gently on the bed they would share for the rest of their lives. And as the night enfolded them in its velvety darkness, Thea knew she had found not just a husband, but a true partner, a man who would stand beside her through whatever life might bring. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the small gathering at Eagle Pass Canyon, the same spot where, 5 years earlier, a wagon had tipped over the edge and a cowboy had caught a schoolteacher's hand before she fell. Thea Kincaid stood a safe distance from the rim, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly where their third child was growing, the other holding tight to 4-year-old Joshua's hand to keep him from wandering too close to the edge. "Stay with Mama, Josh," she reminded him gently. "Remember what Papa said about the canyon. It's dangerous," the boy recited seriously, his dark hair and solemn eyes a mirror image of his father's, "but also beautiful, like life." Thea smiled at the parroting of Roy's philosophy. Her husband stood a few yards away, their 2-year-old daughter Emma perched securely on his shoulders as he pointed out features of the landscape to the fascinated child. They came here every year on this day, a private pilgrimage to commemorate the moment their lives had intersected in such dramatic fashion. It had been Roy's idea originally, a way to honor what he called their second birthday, the day they both began their new lives. This year was special, marking not just the 5th anniversary of their meeting, but also the culmination of years of hard work and careful planning. 3 months ago, Roy had purchased the Triple Diamond Ranch from Mr. Sheffield, who was retiring to live with his daughter in San Antonio. The transition from foreman to owner had been smoother than either of them had anticipated, a testament to the respect Roy had earned over the years. Thea continued to teach, though now only part-time, sharing the position with Mrs. Peterson's niece, who had moved to Sweetwater the previous year. The arrangement allowed Thea to balance her passion for education with her growing family and her new responsibilities as the wife of a ranch owner. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Roy asked, coming to stand beside her, Emma now transferred to his arms where she played with the collar of his shirt. "How much has changed since that day?" Thea replied, leaning against his solid warmth. "How far we've come." Roy nodded, his gaze moving to the canyon edge where he had pulled her to safety. "Sometimes I still wake up in the night and reach for you just to make sure you're really there," he admitted quietly, "that it wasn't all some dream." "I'm really here," Thea assured him, turning to face him fully. We all are, thanks to you. Roy shook his head slightly. Thanks to us, I think. You saved me just as surely as I saved you, Thea, just in a different way. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as Joshua cautiously examined a horned toad nearby, careful not to disturb it as Roy had taught him. You know, Thea said thoughtfully, when I came west to teach, I never imagined I'd find not just a job but a home. A true home with a husband and children and a community that cares for us. And I never thought I'd find a woman willing to take a chance on a man with my past, Roy replied, shifting Emma to his other arm. Let alone one as remarkable as you. Thea smiled up at him, her heart full. We were lucky, weren't we? Beyond lucky, Roy agreed, bending to kiss her softly. Blessed, I'd say. They gathered their children and the small picnic they had brought, preparing to return to the ranch where life and responsibilities awaited. As they rode away from Eagle Pass Canyon, Thea glanced back one last time at the place where she had nearly died, and instead found the beginning of a life more fulfilling than she could have imagined. She thought of all the moments that had led to this one, the financial ruin that had forced her west, the washed-out main road that had diverted her to the canyon route, the crumbling edge that had sent her wagon over, and Roy riding by at precisely the right moment to catch her hand. So many chances for things to go differently, for their paths never to cross. Yet here they were, 5 years later, surrounded by the family they had created together, the love between them stronger than ever. As if reading her thoughts, Roy reached across the space between their horses, his hand finding hers just as it had that fateful day. No regrets, he asked, his eyes warm with love. Not a single one, Thea replied, squeezing his hand. Every step of the journey was worth it, to end up here with you. And as they rode toward home, the Texas sun golden on their backs, Thea knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the most terrifying moments could lead to the greatest joys, and that a hand extended in the right moment could save more than just a life, it could save a heart, a soul, a future previously unimagined. For Thea and Roy Kincaid, that future stretched before them now, as vast and promising as the Texas horizon, and they rode toward it together, hand in hand, just as they had from the very beginning.